All right, so wrong class. So today we'll finish up, I think we should finish up all the material that we'll have on the exam kind of next week. A little bit might spill over into Wednesday. I said Wednesday and Friday this week, we're going to cover some new material, but it won't be expected to be known in the exam. I could have, I guess, rushed things and kind of made you take the exam this Friday, but I thought kind of giving you some time to review. Also, next week on Monday, we'll review. There's those practice problems, so you want to start taking a look at those this week, as well as working through that fourth homework. So that fourth homework will help a lot to review for the exam as well. So I know you can kind of shoot through it real quick. I know, you know, kind of figure out what the right answers are without really processing it in some of them. But I would highly suggest that you kind of really look at those problems to understand why the answers are what they are. And that would be really good kind of practice leading up into that exam as well, right? It's really kind of focusing on these different markets. So, are there any questions from me before we kind of get going here today? It's kind of a roadmap of where we're at. So, we left off kind of talking about monopolistically competitive markets. We kind of were talking about advertising. What you're trying to do with advertising was differentiate your product so that you can get kind of like a higher percent or kind of make a more more inelastic demand curve that you face. And we kind of talked about some pros and cons of kind of advertising. So that's kind of where we left off. One thing that I didn't mention about advertising before we left class was, you know, it can also be a signal of quality. So sometimes kind of advertising lets people know kind of what quality your product is, and kind of introduces, makes people know even that your product exists, right? So, would it be worthwhile to kind of run these ads? We kind of talked about there's somewhat of a arms race, and that each company is just spending money, wasting resources. Well, these really, really expensive ads, you can kind of think about like the ones they run for the Super Bowl. It's not going to really matter if that person only buys the good one time and doesn't like continue to buy it throughout the rest of their life, right? So you want to run an ad that is going to make someone aware of the quality, but you also want to ensure that they're going to kind of continue to buy your product. Otherwise, running that ad is likely not worth kind of whatever you paid for it. What else? What did I not say here? Sometimes seeing companies spend such high amounts of money on ads signals to consumers that that product is in fact worth buying. So it's not just running the ad that signals quality, but potentially spending enough money to get your product in a Super Bowl ad signals to the consumer that, well, if this company is spending this much money, it must be that they know their product is really valuable, it's really high quality, and that consumers are going to want to continue to buy. So sometimes just the company spending a lot of money on these ads is a signal in and of itself to consumers, so then it's going to start purchasing. So along with this idea of advertising, right, we also have kind of branding, right, or brand names. So if you go to the store, the one that always drives me insane is like if you go to buy like ibuprofen or Advil or Tylenol, like first of all, Advil, Tylenol, those are brand names, right? We like literally think products are those brand names when in fact, they are actually just certain chemicals that are used, right, to deal with what inflammation or whatever Tylenol, Advil, see, I'm still saying it, right, are actually kind of instead of saying what the actual chemical is, right? So when you look at different prices for different levels of pain reliever, right, or acetaminophen and things like that, that's the actual name, right? You're literally only paying for the branding when you buy Tylenol's version of acetaminophen, right? You're literally just paying for that name. I think we think of brand names more like with clothing and things like that, but that's a little bit more difficult because usually kind of more popular brand names, there is likely some difference in quality, right? So there is a value in brand names, right? I mean, I would argue that with like acetaminophen or pain relievers, there really isn't. They're literally giving you the exact same product. But when it comes to certain goods like clothing, you can start to think brand names probably do tell you a little bit more about quality. And so, you know, these brands are willing to spend higher amounts on advertising to try to get their name out there because they do provide a slightly differentiated product that might be a little bit better, right? And you as a consumer, right, might not be aware of that, right? So they're going to want to spend money on advertising if they can make you aware of that, or even if their brand isn't any different, like pain relievers, like so Tylenol, Advil run these ads to make you think that they're better than the generic version, right? That Meijer or Walmart's brand of acetaminophen just is wildly different, right? So if they can kind of attract consumers to their specific brand, they've essentially differentiated their product, right? So in the market for pain reliever or acetaminophen, there is no differentiation in the actual product. It's all the same. The only difference is that different brands have kind of made certain consumers think that that brand is a little bit better, right? So they've differentiated their product, not in actuality, but just in thought. It doesn't have to be that you're necessarily providing a differentiated product physically. You just have to provide a differentiated product in the mind of your consumers. That's really all what brand kind of loyalty is. But just like with advertising, you know, there's potentially pros and cons to it. So critics of brand names would say, you know, it's really just perceived differences. Like I'm kind of saying, I'm maybe a little more pessimistic that, you know, there's no difference in Tylenol's acetaminophen or in Walmart's kind of generic version of it, right? That all of this branding is really just creating a perceived difference in product, and the actual benefit to consumers is going to be exactly the same, right? So you're kind of tricking them into thinking that they're going to value a little bit more than they actually are. So, you know, this would lead to kind of a higher demand curve or thinking about the monopolistic competitive, it kind of shifts their demand curve out, potentially allows them to set prices above marginal cost, as we talked about last week. And that if we kind of eliminated some of these trademarks or brand names, potentially, that we could kind of convert a monopolistic competitive market into a perfectly competitive market where we know price is equal to marginal cost, or kind of lower the price a little bit for consumers. So some people would say if we could eliminate brand names, we go from this monopolistic competitive market where we had kind of this downward sloping demand and marginal revenue and had a higher price than what a perfectly competitive market would set. So if we could get rid of these brand names, or these trademarks, we could actually reduce prices for consumers. Reducing prices for consumers would then boost consumer surplus. Defenders of it would say, kind of similar things I would say, you know, it tells you something about the quality of the product. So when it comes down specifically, I always think about like clothing, that's probably a really valid argument that the brand name potentially signals to you something about the quality. It also tells you about maybe things that they're doing along the way. So maybe I trust Tylenol a little bit more than Walmart's generic version of acetaminophen or pain reliever because I think that Tylenol's facilities might be, you know, a little bit more, have a little more high, have higher quality assurance, right? Or kind of making sure their product is exactly what they're providing. So this is just a conclusion slide, but we're kind of meshing kind of last week and this week together. But basically, most goods, when we're really thinking about it, are probably closer to monopolistically competitive than they are to other market structures. We do have some examples of monopolies. We do have some goods which we argue are somewhat perfectly competitive, but even truly homogeneous products, right? Truly undifferentiated products that should be perfectly competitive because of branding, because of advertising, probably are a little bit more closer to a monopolistic competitive than they are perfectly competitive. And so even when we can get these examples that should be a perfectly competitive market, things like advertising, things like branding, have turned this into a slightly differentiated product in the mind of consumers. So the market structure that we're going to focus on today is what we call an oligopoly. So a monopoly is when there's one firm. Oligopolies are when there's a small number of firms, right? So very few. Okay? So I guess this is like the Greek term, right? For few to sell. Monopoly is one to sell. These oligopolies, you know, sometimes we can have a duopoly, where there's only two firms, but maybe we've got 3 or 4. Right? There's some pretty, couple examples like this. If you think about like computers, right? There's like, or computer software, like Windows, Mac. There's probably a couple small other players, but those are like your main players. They make up most of the market share. Right? We're looking at oil. There's a few major players when it comes to kind of oil production or refining. If you look at, what's another good example? Cell phones, right? There's only a few major players. Airline industry, there's only a handful. Probably that one's starting to get a few more, but like every so often you get a new firm and then someone else buys them out, right? So, we've got a lot of examples of this, and really it's going to be, we've only got a few major companies within whatever industry or good we're looking at, and the products can be homogeneous or they can be differentiated, right? So it can look a little bit more like a perfectly competitive market with homogeneous products, or it looks a little bit more sometimes like a monopolistic competitive market where the products are a little bit differentiated. So it's kind of a mesh of all of these that we've talked about to this point. Now, the one difference is even if we have a homogeneous product, each firm is going to have some significant market power. So if we think about a market where there's only two firms, right? Well, each firm might control like half of the market supply. So each firm, their quantity decisions is greatly going to shift that supply curve. When we thought about monopolistically competitive or perfectly competitive markets, so there's so many firms that any one firm, their quantity decision isn't going to like shift overall supply or change the overall kind of equilibrium price. But with an oligopoly, because they control so much of that overall market supply, they actually can influence it. So, to get the characteristics of an oligopoly is a little bit hard because there are so many different varieties, right? So it's a little bit more broad in terms of what their actual characteristics are. But the main characteristic across all of them are they have a small number of firms. Some might have 2, some might have 3, some might have 4, but it's a small number, right? Other than that, right, can't really say much. They could have identical homogeneous products. They could have differentiated products. We could see different market shares. So maybe one industry, you've got one firm that has like 80% of the overall production, and then one other firm that only has 20. Maybe another one you have a 50-50 split, maybe one you have a 60-40. So it can be all these different combinations of the division of market share as well. We'll kind of focus on one today. We're going to kind of on Wednesday, we'll still keep talking about duopolies and oligopolies, but it won't be material I expect in the exam. It's going to introduce another idea, which is called game theory, which we kind of will get a little bit of a taste today, but not pure game theory. So let's say we've got a duopoly. So there's only 2 firms. This would count as an oligopoly. Oligopoly just means there's a small number. I'm looking at a very specific one, which is that we just have 2 firms. Okay? So each firm, right, ideally would have the lowest, like for them, their goal is to have the lowest price, because if they're providing an exact same product, if they're the one that has a lower price, then everyone's going to want to buy the product from them, right? They're providing the exact same good. So the one that is able to provide it at a lower cost, consumers would gravitate towards that company. So what ends up happening in the long run is actually that in these duopolies where we're providing the exact same product, you end up kind of with a perfectly competitive outcome, which is that they'll charge a price that's exactly equal to their marginal cost. So we'll kind of walk through the ideal why. Right? So let's say we've got firm A, and they're currently selling their good for $50. So firm A and firm B are providing the exact same good, right? This is like oil or something like that, where it's not a differentiated price cost. It's literally the exact same, like crude oil. Okay? So we've got firm A who sells it for $50. Well, then firm B looks at it and says, well, if I charge $49, everybody's going to, choose to purchase crude oil from me because it's the exact same product at a lower cost. Right? As long as nothing else is different about the good, why would you pay the higher price? So firm B can basically, like, everyone's going to want to buy from them. They can sell their entire supply, or up to the point wherever it's at least profitable for them, because everyone's going to want to first buy from them. So if firm B does this and charges this lower price, what do you think firm A is going to then do in response? Yeah, as long as the price is still above their marginal cost, they'll say, oh, well, they're charging $49. No, I'm not going to sell it. I'll charge $48. So firm A charges $48. And then what do you think firm B does in response to that? Now they're not selling anything because firm A has the lower price. Kind of they charge 47. This kind of continues all the way down to whatever the last point is profitable for them. Right? Well, what's the last point that's profitable? Well, price is the marginal revenue for these firms, right? The price they're charging. So they'll continue to lower the price all the way down to, hopefully that works, all the way down to when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Any point past that, they're not going to continue to undercut the other firm because, and remember, this is kind of the additional revenue is really whatever that the price they're setting is. Okay? So at any point past this, we know if they lower the price a little bit more, such that marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, this is just going to start kind of eating into profits, right? Or cause profits to become negative. We said one way to think about kind of marginal profits was really just the difference between marginal revenues and marginal costs. So if we start to kind of lower that price or lower marginal revenue, lower marginal costs, we're just kind of decreasing our profits. We wouldn't do that. So they'll undercut each other down to the point where price is exactly equal to marginal cost. At that point, we'd say both firms would be indifferent because they'd be earning profits of 0. So, if they're doing this, it isn't necessarily ideal for either one. I mean, this process of like undercutting each other, like there was benefits until they got down to this point where they're both now earning 0 profits. So what's something they could do potentially to then earn positive profits? Oops. So there you go. So let's think about cell phones. I don't think it's a pure duopoly, although we've got like kind of 3 major players, right? AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, biggest bus brand. So there's other companies, but
if you look at smartphone software, it's a duopoly.
Yeah, so right, you got iOS and yeah, you really only have 2. So we could think about this maybe in terms of the software. Thank you, that's great. But as any industry where you only had like 2 firms who provide a very similar product, you'd argue cell phones maybe a little bit different in the quality of the product. But for the sake of the example, we'll kind of assume they're providing the exact same kind of conditions there. So we've got this demand curve, right? These different combinations of price and quantity. That's the overall demand. So each firm, we look at this. If we were to charge these different price quantity combinations, we could determine what the total revenue would be, right? Revenue is just price times quantity. We could then look at what their costs were. So I've got kind of a column here, what their costs are at all these different quantities, right? As I produce smaller amounts, notice my costs are going low, right? So my variable costs depend on quantity. So when I produce more, my costs are going to be high. We could then look at what the profit is, because that's just going to be the difference between my total revenues and my total costs. So if I look here, I can see where our profits maximize. It's like they're actually at their highest at 1,800, or at a quantity of 60, right? Profits are at 1,800, they're highest at that quantity of 60. So if we allow these firms to kind of compete with each other and they kind of undercut each other's price, we said they'll get down to this point where price is exactly equal to marginal cost. So if we went through here, we've got to determine what the marginal costs are at all of these quantities. And what we end up seeing is, if I don't have a light, never mind, that profit is equal to 0, or this is a long run outcome, price is equal to marginal cost, will result in profit being 0. So they would kind of choose to have overall production of 120 units, and the equilibrium price would be $10. You kind of think about, we looked at what change in costs. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I have to explain this. So we said that they'll undercut each other down to the point where price is equal to marginal cost. If price is my marginal revenue, we kind of think about my profits at this point are equal to 0. So we know that this long run equilibrium after they undercut each other's price should be where profits are equal to 0. But if we looked at this and they could somehow agree, right? So let's say we thought about as a monopoly, right? What would the monopolist do? Well, the monopolist is going to set the price not equal to marginal cost, but they're going to find the quantity. We're setting a single price where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So if we kind of were to construct all of our marginal revenues, all of our marginal costs here, we end up with kind of the optimal quantity for monopolists to choose being 60 units, right? So some of the things we talked about with monopoly relative to, and we think about the duopoly arrives at the perfectly competitive point where price is equal to marginal cost. Relative to that point, the monopolist is going to produce less and charge a higher price, which is what we're going to kind of play out here. If we were to graph all this and kind of determine where that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, this would be there where the monopolist would choose. So the firms look at this duopoly. The two firms look at each other and say, okay, if we both kind of undercut each other's price, arrive at this long-run equilibrium where we're both earning zero economic profits, it's no good for either of us. If we can somehow agree to instead produce at the point where profits would be highest in this market, or what a monopolist would do, right, then we'd both be better off. Right? So before, if you think about this as the overall production, so we have two firms, they're producing a quantity of 120, so each firm will be producing 60. Right? If instead they come to each other and say, look, I promise that if you also produce only 30 units, I'll only produce 30 units as well, which the total market quantity would then be 60. And we know that as a result, the price that we could charge would be much higher, right? We know that we could essentially think about kind of what this would look like graphically. So we've got their marginal costs. We'll assume they face kind of the same marginal costs, providing like crude oil, like you would really have the same cost structure there. So instead of getting down to where that perfectly competitive price would be, which would be exactly equal to marginal cost at that 120 units, so we have two firms, so each will be producing 60. Instead, I'll agree to only produce 30 units if you produce 30 units, which results in there being 60 units on the market. And we know that at that 60 units, we could act as a monopolist together and we would be able to charge, consumers would be able to be willing to pay a higher price. We could charge that higher price if we would both kind of restrict our quantities to only 30 units apiece. So this is the idea that if they don't kind of talk to each other, or they're just trying to kind of focus on their own profits, they'll continue to undercut each other down to this point where price is equal to marginal cost at the quantity they choose. Right? Price is exactly equal to marginal cost. If they instead are able to come to an agreement, or we sometimes call this collusion, and produce lower quantities, both of them produce lower quantities, they can charge a higher price. Instead of earning zero economic profits now, total profits in the market would be kind of, they're acting as a monopolist. So they're able to kind of maximize profits, right? Setting price kind of above marginal cost. And they would split these profits together, right? So each firm, if they restricted their quantity down to 30, resulting in a total market quantity of 60, there's two firms, could split this profit. Instead of having zero profits, they would each have what, 900 here? So, we have a small number of firms we might be concerned with. They're going to coordinate their quantity decisions so that they can act as like a monopolist together. Any questions on that? So kind of using this demand schedule just to have some numbers, but really all we're thinking about there is when they both, if they allow, if they don't talk with each other, they'll continually undercut each other down to that perfectly competitive point where profits will equal to zero. If they instead come to an agreement and collude, they can restrict their quantity decisions to mirror what a monopolist would do and earn positive economic profits. So when we have these duopoly markets, we sometimes see positive profits if they're able to collude or kind of coordinate their quantity decisions. So this is kind of, I've already said it, but collusion is basically when you're coming to an agreement. So you're trying to coordinate your quantity or your production decisions so that you can increase the price that you're able to charge for that good, and then higher prices kind of resulting in those higher economic profits. So that was kind of the long run equilibrium. If they were able to collude, was that they both restrict their quantity decision to 30, they're able to charge that higher price, and they both now have positive economic profits. I don't think that we necessarily, this is probably the most practical that like you would see cell phones necessarily collude. But in the oil industry, there are tons of historical examples of collusion. We sometimes you will see these referenced as a cartel, right? This doesn't necessarily have to just be two people. In the crude oil, we'll go over it kind of, you know, where crude oil is produced, a lot of the individuals that are the companies that are doing that try to coordinate their production decisions to influence the price of a barrel of crude oil so that all of those firms can kind of increase their profits. And instead of being hyper competitive with each other and undercutting each other's price, they are trying to coordinate their quantity decisions so that they can actually all experience positive profits. And this is something that happens all the time. And that's bad for consumers, right? It basically just goes back to a monopoly model where we now have this deadweight loss, we cut into consumer surplus, and you know, all these negative things. So we try to regulate these. We don't want to see any kind of coordination or cooperation and quantity decisions across firms because we know that's overall bad for the market. It's going to result in deadweight loss. Right? We said a monopolist, right, when they're choosing quantity or marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, that would result in losing on all this surplus that we would have seen if we could arrive at that perfectly competitive quantity. So we don't like to see this. So, let's think about, hopefully, you know, maybe some non-regulatory things that can affect this. So we've got that same output, or sorry, same demand structure, quantity, and price. Let's say they come to an agreement and they're producing at this monopoly point where they're both producing 30 units. Right? So if they come to this agreement and then one of the players, we'll say T-Mobile here, decides, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to increase. I'll tell them I'm going to only produce 30 units, but I'm actually going to produce 40 units. Well, if T-Mobile does that, so I have all this on that. I was hoping that I had it multiple things. If T-Mobile does that, right? Well, now we have, what did I say? Was it Verizon? So Verizon produces 30, T-Mobile is producing 40. The total quantity in the market is going to be 70. So that would result in a price of 35. Okay. Well, at that price of 35, right, T-Mobile is selling 40 units now. So what, 35 times 40 is going to be $1,400. So they've actually increased their profits from 900 to 1,400, right? Because if they were the only one producing this higher quantity, there's a little bit of a benefit to that, right? It reduced the price a little bit, but they have this extra 10 units they can sell. And so that what they lost out on from that price reduction, they made up for with that quantity increase. Now, if Verizon had kind of stuck to the agreement, they're kind of screwed because they're still producing 30 units, but now instead of that $40 they could charge if they both, you know, stuck to that agreement, now they're only able to sell for 35. So 35 times their 30 units is going to be less than that $900 of profits they were earning before. So there's an incentive for both of these firms to be the one that breaks the agreement. So if they're the one that breaks the agreement, yeah, they'll take a little bit of a hit on profits because the price will go down from increasing production. But if they're the one that has more units to sell, they can make up for that loss from the price reduction by selling more units than they were before. So there's this incentive for each firm to be the one that breaks the agreement. The problem is, if they both have the incentive to break the agreement, they both might break the agreement. So if instead of kind of this agreed upon 30 units, maybe they both break it, they both produce 40. So now the overall quantity in the market is 80. So they can only charge a price of 30, right? Where we go? There we go. So we already kind of worked through this one, right? Let me see. So this was where if there was only one that breaks it, if they both break the agreement and produce at a quantity of 40, well, now that lower price of $30, they're each going to have kind of lower profit amounts. So if I'm the firm that breaks the agreement, I can increase my profits from 900 to 1,000 here. But if we both break the agreement, now our profits both, instead of being 900, we're both only making 800. So this exists for like a 10-unit increase. So let's say they both break the agreement, they both produce this higher quantity of 40, the market quantity is 80, results in lower profits for each of them. Well, then what happens the next go around when they're making a production decision? Well, they both know that each other's going to break the agreement, or there's an incentive for the other person to break the agreement. And it's always better to be the one who breaks the agreement. If the other person sticks to it and you kind of break the agreement and produce this higher quantity, you can actually increase your profits, right? So there's always this incentive for both individuals to break this agreement. And a lot of times what we end up seeing with is because there's this incentive in the long run, both of these firms will kind of break the agreement. They'll kind of increase production, try to be the one that is the only person increasing production. And we basically end up back at this point where they're hyper competitive and they end up setting a price exactly equal. So in practice, we don't see a lot of collusion work. And that's because each firm has this incentive to be the one that breaks from the agreement. I probably won't expect you to kind of be able to kind of work, reproduce kind of what I just went through. I think for the exam, what I would kind of focus on when we're thinking about oligopolies is that if they could come to an agreement and they both hold to it, right, that they should choose whatever price that the monopolist would choose. They'll kind of act as a monopolist together. And they'll set that single price where marginal cost is equal to marginal labor. Now, they're not actually setting the price as much as they're choosing the quantity that would result in being able to charge that monopoly price. But it's really just two different sides of the same coin. If I change my production such that we can get down to this market quantity of 60, or I set the price high enough where I know that only 60 units will be purchased, right? They both have the same kind of outcomes, right? Just I'm kind of using different mechanisms to do the exact same thing. So I can either restrict quantity, get down to a point where I can charge this higher price, or I can just come to an agreement to set a higher price so that I'll kind of sell that lower number of units, resulting in kind of higher economic profits, higher than zero, which is what will happen if we kind of continually compete with each other and undercut each other's price. Any questions on this idea? I mean, it's not, like I said, it's not really something new necessarily. It's more so thinking about that if these firms can come to an agreement, we'll see basically the market look like what a monopolist would choose. If they can't come to, they break the agreement, they basically end up in this long run outcome where we see the perfectly equal or perfectly competitive equilibrium price and quantity kind of play out. All right, so the other thing that I want to go through today, actually what I have here. Oh, I forgot I put these in here. You know, we could walk through this. I think I showed you just if they both increase from 30 to 40 and when they break the agreement. If you then go to the next step, okay, instead of producing 40, they know everyone's, the other side's going to break the agreement. So maybe they just start increasing, ramping up production. So they both start producing 50. Now the market equilibrium, the market quantity is at 100. They can charge they have to charge a lower price now. We can determine what profits are. The profits are going to be lower. Oops. And then we kind of walk through this all the way down to the point where they're going to end up where profits are equal to zero, right? So it's just might take some time, right? But they might slowly increase production, but over time they'll eventually kind of end up at that long range equilibrium. So what I really want to make sure we get through today, and this will be the last thing that we can see on the exam. This shouldn't be too. I don't think this is tough. We'll talk about different measures of market concentration, so that if we were looking at sales numbers, we could potentially determine what different markets, what industry's market structure looks like. Is it a monopoly? Is it an oligopoly? Is it a pretty competitive market? And so the very first look we would do is look at this, what we call the concentration ratio. So all we're going to do with this concentration ratio is take the top 4 firms' market shares and add them all up. So maybe I'm looking at, I don't know, automobiles or something. And I see like Ford, Chevy, Toyota, and Honda. I'm guessing those are the top 4 sales in that market. And maybe Ford has like 20%. Chevy, I don't know, has 15. I'm making these up. There's 15, and maybe Honda's 10. Well, the 4 firm concentration ratio would just be you take these 4 market shares and you just add them up. Right? It's pretty simplistic. Once you have the actual market shares of the top 4 firms, you just add them up. I think that's not terribly difficult. So there, that higher that concentration ratio is, really what that's telling you is the higher the percent those top 4 firms control. Right? So we wouldn't want that to be, very high. In fact, what would the 4 firm concentration ratio be for a monopolist? 100%. Right? There's only one firm. The top 4 firms, there's really only one. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. This is an okay measure, but it's not perfect, because what if I'm looking at the concentration ratio for a duopolist? Well, if I had a duopolist, let's assume they split evenly. Each firm would have 50%, and I add that up, I'd have the same concentration ratio for a duopolist as I did for a monopolist. Right? So this concentration ratio is nice for identifying industries that are starting to move towards kind of like these oligopolies or these monopolies, but they can't differentiate between a monopoly and a duopoly. Right? So it allows us to start to look, identifying markets that are starting to get a little bit too concentrated, starting to get a little bit too much of overall market share with those top 4 firms. But if we're looking at those really, really concentrated industries where we see monopolists and duopolists, this measure isn't going to do a whole lot for us. Right? So if we saw a concentration ratio of like 1% or something really low, that's going to tell us that this is a very, very competitive industry. Because think about it, if I had a 4 firm concentration, well, we'll do this example. Let's say I had 4 different firms, the top 4 firms in a specific industry, and they're all earning 1%, right? Such that like maybe we'll say that there's 100 firms, and they're all splitting, they all split demand, kind of all split market share. So each firm is earning 1%. Well, then my 4 firm concentration ratio, if I added it up, would be something like 4%. So if I'm seeing a concentration ratio of 1%, I know that I've got an industry where there's a ton of firms, and they all have a very small amount of market share. Right? I would imagine this is probably something like I don't know, cell phone accessories or something like. There's all these like brand names you wouldn't even recognize. All these different companies producing these accessories for cell phones, and all of them have a very, very small market share. So something really close to 0 tells us it's a very, very close to a perfectly competitive market. Anything that's like up at 100%, this is telling us we're looking at one of those market structures where we've got a monopoly or a loss. Right? Or maybe an oligopoly, right? We've only got 3 or 4 things. So if I'm looking at this example, how would I come up with it looking at the actual data? So we've got kind of our 4 different firms, and then we have all the other firms combined, right? So how would I turn these different amounts of sales into market shares? Yeah, well, I first need to find the total. So I've got these 4 firms and all the other firms. So I could just add all this up, and that would give me the total sales in that industry. So once I have the total sales in that industry, kind of change these into kind of percentage that each firm earns, I would divide each one by the total, right? And then so I have kind of one more thing I'd have to do there, which is what? So if I divide, let's say I had this example, let's say I had, some firm had 100, well, let's just do 100. Let's not worry about thousands. This won't be very applicable, but it'll help us see this. Let's say a firm that has $100 in sales. The total industry, I don't know, has $1,000 total in sales. Maybe this is like a lemonade stand or something. Then like turn this into a what percent is this firm sell? This is only going to be 0.1, but that doesn't reflect the percent. That is like the proportion of sales, right? So to turn this into percentage, once I divide by the total, I then have to multiply by 100. That then turns this into 10%. So I go through each one of these firms, divide by that total sales, right? So I think I was just, I do that differently. So I'll tell you probably an easier way. I think might be, and I'll show you the second way as well. So I would turn each one of these in to like a level of sales, right? The percent of sales each firm had. And then I could go back to then just having 4 numbers that I have to add up. Now, what I could do is first take the total sales from the top 4 firms and then divide it by the total number of sales across all firms as well. That's what I was doing here. So either way, you'll get the same answer. I don't know, I think a lot of times for most people, it's easier to think about find the market share of each firm first and then add them up. But you could just add up all the sales and then divide by the total number of sales across every firm to get that 4 firm concentration ratio as well, right? Once again, you would also have to multiply that by 100 and kind of convert that proportion into a percentage. Right? But either method, you should end up with the same answer. Does that make sense? Any questions about what I'm saying there? So you could just take the top 4 firm sales, add them up, then divide by the total. Right? That would be one way, and then multiply by 100 to get the percentage. Or you could find the percentage for each firm first, and then just add those 4%. Either way, should get us to that same answer. So this one should be really easy, hopefully. So if I'm looking at different operating systems for cell phones here, I've got the top 4 firms, and every other firm only has about 0.1% here. So I've turned these into percentages for you. I've made this one a little bit easier. So instead of showing you the sales, I converted their sales already into the percent of the market share they own. So if I'm looking here, the 4 firm concentration ratio, or the concentration ratio here, which of the following would that be? So give you a little bit of time. This one shouldn't be too tough. You've got your top 4 firms, and then every other firm that's in this industry. So if I'm looking for that top 4 firm concentration ratio, what would that be? All right, if you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. Everybody got 29 of us, 30 of us? Everyone got their answer in? All right, I'm gonna close it out. So all I have to do here is take the percent each of the top 4 firms earns, which I have up here, and add them up, right? So 52.8 plus 43.6 plus 2.7 plus 0.8. Which another way of thinking about that is if all other firms other than these top 4 earn 0.1%, and those top 4 firms must be earning 99.9%, right? So all you're doing there is just adding up the percent of sales from each of those top 4 firms. Okay? Any questions on that? So this is with some actual data. I think it's a little bit old, but like you pointed out earlier, this cell phone operating system industry is heavily concentrated, right? I mean, it's almost up at 100%, which would look something like a monopoly or a duopoly.
There was Microsoft and BlackBerry a couple of years ago, but they both moved to Android.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll see new players commit. So a lot of times, that's actually a good point. So a lot of times what we see happen is firms will try to enter some of these industries that are like oligopolies and kind of move it towards being a more competitive industry. The problem is once you start to see other players, what often happens is they just get gobbled up by whatever the old existing kind of power players are. So back in the day, this happened all the time with telephone providers. We see it happen a lot with airline industry. I just saw something, was it one of the crappy airlines? It was like Spirit or JetBlue, one of them just got bought up by somebody else, right? So we sometimes see these markets will start to move away from kind of being heavily concentrated, but then a lot of times what happens is that we see these huge mergers. And I just go right back to, why would we see these mergers? Well, as the market becomes more competitive, we said earlier, that starts to drive down the price. So then these two firms look at each other and say, well, look, you know, we're competing so much with each other. What if we just like join forces, increase our market power, right? By increasing our market share, and are able to kind of then increase or influence the price a little bit more because now we have a higher percent of the overall kind of market. I'll show you a couple things here. So another measure that we have is called, I just always say HHI, but it's the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. So all you're doing there is taking each firm's market share, adding them all up, and here each firm market share squared, and then adding them all up, and then we multiply at the end by 10,000. The multiplying by 10,000 is just to kind of give us something that's a little bit more, I don't know, numbers, and we're not looking at like these small decimals. And really what we're doing there is the market share, when you square that value and then multiply by 10,000, it'd really be the same as if you took the percentages and squared them, because 100, right, to turn a market share into a percentage, I said we multiply by 100, but then if you square 100, that's 10,000, so it's really kind of doing the same thing. You can either take the market share as a proportion and then add them up and multiply by 10,000 at the end, or you can just take the market shares as percentages, square them, and then you don't have to worry about multiplying by 10,000 at the end. So I'll kind of, next class, I'll show you, I don't think I have on this slide, but I'll have some other formulas, kind of look at this a little bit, maybe present this in a little bit better of a way. But really, the HHI, the highest we could see would be 10,000, right? If monopolists had 100% of the overall market share, 100 squared is 10,000, there's no other firms, that's the highest HHI we'd ever see. If we think about like a duopolist, what would their HHI be? Well, if they split it evenly, each firm would have 50%. So 50 squared plus 50 squared, right? So it's gonna be what? 5,000, I think, right? 50 squared is 2,500, 50 squared is 2,500. Add them up, you have 5,000. So the HHI is a little bit nicer than the concentration ratio because now we can start to differentiate between monopolists and duopolists. And not only can we do that, if I had a duopolist that both evenly split, right, a 50-50 split, that's going to end up with a lower HHI than if I have a market where it's 90-10, right? Because then 90 squared, right, would be 8,100 plus 10 squared would be 100. So I'd have like a 9,200 HHI for a duopolist where it was a 90-10 split, but only a HHI of 5,000 where I have a duopolist that's an even split. So this measure kind of allows me to differentiate not only from a monopolist to a duopolist, but also different types of duopolies or different types of oligopolies. And then if we can get something that's really close to zero, this is going to be reflective of a perfectly competitive market where we have a ton of firms with really, really small market shares. Imagine if we had 100 firms, really, really small market shares. 1 squared is 1, right? Add up 100 different firms, we only have an HHI of 100, right? That's quite a bit lower than the monopolist HHI of 10,000. So all we're doing there is plugging in the percent market shares for each one of these firms in the industry, squaring them, and then adding them all up. So I had a couple examples I thought were interesting. You can kind of look across different industries. Really high concentrated industries up here. We're thinking about like duopolies, oligopolies. As we start to kind of move down, they're a little bit more kind of competitive, like automobile industry. I wrote 4 major players earlier, but there's definitely other car companies that are pretty competitive there. Beer's an interesting one. You might think, well, there's tons of different types of beer. They're literally like all owned by the same company. Like Anheuser-Busch has like, it basically makes a ton of different products, right? So their overall market share is really, really high. So if you dive into the beer industry, you can kind of see like Anheuser-Busch has like 50% of the overall market share. And I think Coors is they're the other one that has kind of the second highest. So we can take a look at different ones. I think auto manufacturers start to look a little bit more, a little more competitive. You got a couple more players here. Once again, this was the example we looked at, the operating system for cell phones, heavily concentrated. So you can dive into this, and all you're really doing is breaking down the sales of every company in that industry.
Aren't almost all food products owned by the same big corporation? Or nearly?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I'm sure it is, because there's the distribution, the economies of scale that would exist, like be able to get to that lower cost when you have massive quantities that you're producing and distributing. I would imagine you only have a few major players for that, just because of distribution. Anything where you have heavy distribution is going to be really hard to have several infrastructure. All right, so you've got that homework. I'm going to go through that, start using that to practice for the exam. I've got those 2 sets of practice problems up there with answers. Those would be really good to start reviewing for that exam as well. Other than that, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out as you're kind of preparing for that exam next Wednesday. Okay? All right, we'll see you guys Wednesday.